Hello and welcome to another episode of Inside EMA, a podcast about the science behind medicines regulation and the people who make it possible. My name is Alessandro, I'm a communication officer at EMA and I will be your host for today. Today we will talk about how data is changing the way we regulate medicines, how it's adding more value to it. And to do so, we have two guests who will help me navigate this very interesting topic. So first of all, Peter Arlett. Peter is the head of the Data Analytics and Methods Task Force at EMA. Welcome, Peter.
Thank you.
And next to Peter, Denise Umuhire. Denise is a real-world evidence specialist here at EMA. And I think you will help us also understand what exactly is real-world evidence. I said it in my premise. This is a conversation about how now we have different types of data that we can access, how we can use it to generate more evidence, and how this changes or supports the decision we are taking on medicines. Peter, I want to start with you, maybe with almost historical and future-looking perspective. So, how are things changing, and in which direction?
Well, I think the first thing I would say is that some things are not changing at all. So as regulators, we authorise medicines based on their demonstrated quality, safety and effectiveness. And we always ensure that the benefits outweigh any potential risks. And that's not changing. The focus in recent years has been to support getting medicines to patients faster. And the way we think is key to that is to ensure we have excellent clinical evidence. Now, excellent clinical evidence means that we, first of all, focus on the patient voice. What are the patient's needs? We then ensure that all decision-making on the gathering of evidence is based on what has gone before. So what clinical trials in this therapeutic area have occurred before? What drugs have previously been developed? And looking at the totality of knowledge in the past. We then have to define the research question. And once we've got the research question, in other words, what do we need to know in order to get this product on the market? How do we need to demonstrate efficacy, effectiveness, for example? What are the safety issues that we want to address? We then look at the totality of different methods anchored in the clinical trial, but perhaps embracing other methods as well, methods that maybe 10 years ago were not routinely used. If we then look at what those might be, well, let's first think about different types of data. Perhaps at the core of this complement to clinical trials is real-world data. But it doesn't just stop with real-world data. It might be genomics data. It might be data from wearables. It might be social media data. It might even be synthetic data or digital twins that people are interested in at the moment. So if we look at these new data types, they can potentially, when analysed, complement clinical trials evidence. Maybe just before finishing, I would say that there are also changes in the methods that we're applying. So again, clinical trials, randomised clinical trial is the foundation, but we may want to look at modelling data, at simulation, at extrapolation from one data source or one population to another. And there's a lot of interest as well in Bayesian approaches, Bayesian statistics. In other words, looking at the totality of data and evidence to help us form a decision or reach a decision. And if we put all of that together, it's not a revolution, it's an evolution, and it's about complementing clinical trials with new data and new methods. But we believe in that way we can accelerate drug development and fulfill unmet medical needs of patients.
So if I summarize, it's using all the new data that we now have access to and also the new capabilities to analyze that data and use it to complement, the gold standard, which is still randomized clinical trials, so clinical trials that are conducted on large numbers.
That's right, and always focused on patient need and patient preference, I would say.
And Denise, your focus is especially on real-world evidence, which I think is a term that maybe is not familiar to our audience. So maybe if you can just talk us through what is real-world evidence.
Okay. Yes. So as Peter just explained, real-world evidence is one aspect of the evidence that is used to make a decision. And we have to remind ourselves that we are in the scope of regulatory decision-making, where we are authorizing medicine based on their benefit and risk. So real-world evidence, the term itself means the analysis of real-world data. And real-world data is, as opposed to clinical data from clinical trials, is the data that is collected on patient individuals in routine clinical care. This refers to your or my health data when we go to see our GP or when we go in the emergency room. This also refers to the data that is collected in the scope of organizing reimbursement of medicines. This is what we call claims data, so insurance data, for example. But it also includes, importantly, data that are collected on diseases, because we need to understand these diseases and the epidemiology. And most often here we are considering data from registries. So these are organized, structured data collection, usually led by clinicians or by patients themselves in one specific disease area. So all those are sources of real-world data. Once we analyze it to answer a specific research question, as Peter explained, we generate real-world evidence.
And it's interesting because this is the data that happens, as the word says, in the real world. So it's less, let's say, of an in the clinical trials, in the end, the setup, we could say in a way it's artificial, while this is like data that is generated. So I would guess that it's also more interesting in terms of how do you need to homogenize it, interpret it.
So it's there are different settings, and they're in different settings for different purposes. You need to have a controlled environment to establish a causality, basically saying this drug brings this added value or cures or treats this disease, and the effect is really solely associated to this drug. That's why you need the controlled environment to establish that. But you can also answer other questions that are also relevant for decision making, which do not necessarily require a controlled environment. If you want to understand who are the patients affected by a disease, you have to look at the whole population and describe the symptoms that they have, how it impacts on their life, the treatments that they are taking. So you need to be in a non-controlled environment to answer certain questions. And those questions are also equally important when considering certain aspects of drug development and access to drug or monitoring of the drug. If you want to understand what are the side effects of a treatment that is already on the market, you have to go into the real world and see what is happening to the patient, and then collect all the safety information that are reported, and that will constitute a set of real world data.
So, Alessandro, I mean, just to put that another way, certain questions are best answered through clinical trials, other questions are best answered through real-world evidence. And particularly the demonstration that a product works in most situations and with most products will be best demonstrated through a clinical trial. But looking at how a medicine works in everyday medical practice can only be done really using real-world evidence. So those would be the sort of summary situations.
In a simplified way.
In a simplified way.
And when we talk about real-world evidence at EMA, we especially have in mind DARWIN EU. DARWIN EU is a research network. So that basically we use to answer some of the questions we have on medicines, as Peter explained. We have 40 data partners that are involved in DARWIN EU, and we cover 250 million patients. So the data that is collected from 250 million patients, and in 18 member states. So it's if I introduce it like this, I mean, it can sound very complicated, and I'm sure that it is complicated. But maybe you can explain to our audience what is DARWIN EU and what do we use it for?
Yes, of course. I think you've already given a good indication. So, for regulators to generate real-world evidence, there are different pathways. One of them, and the most important one we have set up and we are currently using, is indeed DARWIN EU. So it's a group of data partners that are working together to generate evidence in parallel at the same time. These allow us to answer questions on European populations, looking at different countries at the same time, and have a good indication of what might be going on in a disease or with a certain treatment. So DARWIN EU, as you explained, has 40 data partners, even more than 40 data sources. And this can be electronic health records type of data. They can be primary care data. They can be hospital data. We have also biobanks. And the idea is that when we have a research question, we discuss with the assessors and committee who do the actual work of evaluating medicines. And then we submit this question to the DARWIN EU network for it to be answered through as many as available data sources that have the data needed for answering the research question. So without going into complicated details of this, what it means is that if we want to know how many patients have disease X, for example, we will then ask all the data partners in DARWIN EU to look into their databases and identify, using a diagnosis code, for example, how many patients have that diagnosis code. And that information can then support the discussions that are happening at the committee levels.
And I think one important point is that the data is not held centrally, but it's held locally.
Yes, so there are a couple of important design features of the Darwin network. Firstly, as you say, data stay local, so we are not transferring personal data, healthcare data, from one member of the network to the other. A question goes to the data holder, they run analyses locally, and then send back anonymized results. The other point that is important to the design of the network is that all of the data in the network have been converted into a common format. It's called a common data model. And what this means is that when you want to run a study, you can do it very quickly using the same computer script across all the different data sources. And that can be incredibly important if you need an urgent answer to a question. Let's say you're assessing a potential safety issue with a medicine.
Okay. Let's go into maybe some examples of how we have used this network and this data to support our decisions on medicines.
So let's maybe start with examples in the safety area where real-world evidence has been mostly established, if I may say. So we've conducted several studies in this area, and all of them are, by the way, available in the HMA EMA catalog of real-world data. So if people are interested, they can also read more about those there.
And we will make sure, sorry to interrupt, to add the link to the description of the episode for people that are curious.
Yes, indeed. And so we can take an example of a study we did following a signal of suicidality potentially associated with the use of doxycycline, which is an antibiotic widely used to treat many infections, including acne. And the committee requested that we conduct a study through DARWIN EU to understand if there was indeed a potential association between the use of this antibiotic and the symptoms of suicidality within the patients. So what we did was, together with the assessors involved in the study, define very clearly what were the parameters to look for in the databases, and then conduct a study comparing patients who are being treated with doxycycline for acne versus those who are being treated with other treatments also for acne. And at the end of the whole analysis, the conclusion was that there was not an association, a strong evidence for establishing an association between the use of doxycycline and the impact on suicidality thoughts as they were reported.
And maybe just to emphasize why that's important, because it's not evidence of a side effect, it's evidence of not having a side effect. But that can be really important because it means that doctors and patients can continue to use the medicine as before. I mean, if there had been uncertainty, sometimes using a sort of precautionary principle, there may have been restriction of the medicine, for example. But this strong, high-quality evidence that there wasn't an association enabled the committee, the EMA committee that takes decisions on safety issues, to if you like, give the antibiotic a clean bill of health and for the use in acne to continue.
So just to understand and to recap maybe, so our committee, let's say, is looking at a certain problem. It can be effectiveness, it can be safety, asks a question and we are able to answer it and to have, let's say, supporting evidence to the rest of the totality of the evidence through the use of Darwin, which I think, again, goes back to the concept that we were saying at the beginning. So this is we're not substituting, we're actually adding layers of evidence.
Yes, although the example that when we were talking about clinical trials being the foundation, we were particularly looking for drugs in development and the demonstration of efficacy, so the demonstration that a drug works. There's no doubt the clinical trials will be the gold standard, if you like, of evidence. In the area of safety and an issue like suicidality, with doxycycline, it would have been impossible to conduct a clinical trial because it's if it was associated, then it was very, very rare, and it would not have been feasible to do a clinical trial. Therefore, an epidemiological and observational study like the one done in Darwin essentially is the gold standard in drug safety.
Yes, and the decision is made by the committee taking that piece of evidence together with the rest of what they have already at their hands. So they had also these signals of these safety cases, but also literature and additional evidence. So put together, everything pointed in the direction of no potential association at this stage.
And do we have other examples or another example maybe that comes to mind?
Yes, we have many other examples. So the one we just gave is in the post-authorization phase for drug development where real-world evidence has been mostly established. But we see more and more use of real-world data also earlier on in drug development or even during the evaluation of a medicine before it's put on the market. And in the drug development, for example, you can imagine we've done some studies to describe epidemiology, incidence, prevalence of certain diseases to inform decisions. In the evaluation itself, for example, we have one concrete example. When a drug is being developed, usually the development is in the adult population, but it's also important to demonstrate that the same disease is not also affecting pediatric population while not necessarily putting at risk of trials young children who might not need to do so. So we've done some studies to inform the decisions that are made by the committee whether or not a clinical trial should be conducted in the younger pediatric population. And one example was done for a disease that affects a skin condition, so dermatomyositis, polymyositis, to understand if there was a need for a study in that specific population, and then recommend for the company to develop a program in the young population. So the study we've conducted showed that there were available younger patients with the same disease in the specific age group where it will be necessary to conduct a study. So an obligation was placed on the applicant to run a study in that population because from the look of the analysis in DARWIN EU, we could see enough patients to justify a clinical trial in that specific younger population. And
we know that is an issue that in medicine's regulation or in the development that sometimes the pediatric formulations are not always available, and it's something that we actually proactively try to address.
Yeah, just to emphasize that point, to put this into context. So over the last 15 years in the European Union, we've had a specific regulatory framework in place to ensure that clinical trials are done in children when it's appropriate to do so. And that's because the problem statement was that whereas you may have a large number of medicines authorised with specific evidence for their use in adults, frequently the use of medicines in children was not based on a good evidence base. So clinical trials had not been conducted, or observational studies conducted for that matter. So this is quite a nice example that Denise is giving, because it's informing the regulator as to whether or not a clinical trial should be imposed on a company that at that time was only developing the medicine for adults. Now, I don't know the outcome of the clinical trial. I don't suppose the clinical trial is finished yet in children, but at least we will then have evidence that shows that either the medicine does work or doesn't work. Yeah, we know there's a need. That's the key point. Yeah.
And Peter, where do you see the evolution of Darwin, for example, in the next few years?
Yeah, so maybe if I just touch on Darwin, then I might broaden your question a little bit. So Darwin has been a success. Our stakeholders have judged it a success. The committees have judged it a success because it's informing decision-making. And just to put a quantity on this, we've initiated well over 100 studies through Darwin over the last few years, and that's unprecedented in terms of volume of observational studies for regulatory decision making. So based on that success, we want to continue and we want to build further. So what does building mean? It means more data partners, access to data from more patients, filling some of the gaps. So we don't have data from all European Union countries at the moment. And where data are available, we want to be able to onboard those the data partners from those countries. There may be niche populations and niche data sets also that could be very informative for decision making, which are not currently within the network. So we will build in that way. And the more data we onboard, the more questions we can answer, the better decisions we can make on medicines, basically. So that's the Darwin for the next couple of years. Maybe it would be appropriate at this stage to mention European health data space. So I think many of the listeners will have heard of the European health data space. Two pillars. One is about delivery of healthcare, so particularly cross-border healthcare. It's called the European Health Data Space 1. And then the European Health Data Space 2 is about reusing healthcare data for research, for regulatory decision-making, basically for better health in Europe. And this is a huge promise, if you like. So from 2029, there will be processes and rules in place that mean that we as regulators, but also researchers, should be able to access healthcare data from across, from all the different member states in Europe. And we believe this will give us broader and deeper access to data, which, if we then combine that with Darwin and other mechanisms, means that we'll be able to answer more and more questions for the sake of better decision-making on medicines.
I have two more questions, and then I think I'm going to wrap up this conversation. One is about patient experience data. So there are all the types of data that actually Peter explained at the beginning, but one that it's very dear to us as an agency is the subjective, if you will, data of the patients that are, for example, taking a medicine and can record their experiences. Is there space for this type of data in real world evidence?
Oh yes, absolutely. As you said, it's closer and dear to us. As Peter explained at the beginning, patients are at the starting point for all that we do. So it totally makes sense, and it's only natural that patient experience data, which, by the way, I don't know if the audience knows what it means, but in a simplified way, we put behind the term patient experience data all the data that are collected directly from the patients without any intermediary interpretation. So these include patient-reported outcomes. So when patients just fill in forms or surveys on the symptoms that they experience, for example, includes patient preference studies, so where we ask patients to make trade-offs between different choices. And this also includes information collected through patient engagement. And EMA is very well known for having very well-established mechanism for all of those, especially the patient engagement. We have patient representatives in many of the committees and the discussions that happen. We consult with patients. So all this information coming directly from patients are very important. not just at one specific stage, but actually throughout the whole life cycle of product development. So what we describe for real-world data applies also for patient experience data. It's a new set of data, I would say, that in terms of how big of impact it creates or how clearly visible in the reports this type of data are, but the agency encourages developers and the patients to really put forward that data because they contribute to informing several aspects of the decision making as well. And it's a growing area of interest for us indeed, I would say, Peter.
No, I agree. And so Denise is focused on the data from patients, if you like. But if you take a step back, fundamentally, we're developing medicines for patients, and patients and patient advocates have been arguing for many years that their voice should be stronger and stronger in development of medicines and in the design choices when collecting evidence, be it the design of a clinical trial, be it the design of an observational study. And as an agency, EMA is looking to see how we can facilitate strengthening that patient voice throughout the process.
An important dimension when we talk about data and health data in particular is trust. So how do we ensure that there is trust in the way we use this data?
Well, we have a mechanism, let's say, to ensure trust in the data and the evidence generation almost by design. So what we explain about DARWIN EU, for example, being a federated network whereby the data stays local, is partially a principle that allows us to respect non-transfer of data. So by definition per se, we build trust by ensuring that we respect data protection, that we have infrastructure that ensures security of the data, and that we are transparent in what we do. So what data we access, why we access it, research questions, and how we use it. All of those elements are fully transparent to ensure that people trust in what we do with regards to that, the real-world evidence generation.
Yeah, and you mentioned earlier in the discussion these catalogues, these public catalogues of all the studies done, so people can see what the questions were, how it was done, in a lot of detail if they wish to. Maybe just to complement that, and that's to talk not just about trust in the research process, but also trust in medicines more generally. I think we consider that at the core of trust in medicines and in medicines regulation, medicines development, is really, really good evidence. We talked right at the beginning about excellent clinical evidence. And if we have really good evidence that a medicine works and that a medicine is safe, then that, we believe, is the bedrock of trust in society in the medicines.
We've reached the end of this conversation. And so before I let you go, any recommendations for our viewers, something they can read if they want to learn more about real-world evidence?
Yes, indeed. A good and short read actually is the paper we published on excellence in clinical evidence, I would say.
Yeah, I think that would be a nice one. And then it would be complemented by a vision we set out a couple of years ago on real-world evidence, which has stood the test of time. So that would be a nice complementary paper.
Okay, both links are noted and are in the description of this video. Peter, Denise, thanks a lot for your time. It was a pleasure. Thanks a lot for watching. Please drop us a follow, a like, or a comment, and we will see you next time with a new episode.